Hello, everybody. Just want to make sure that my speaker is plugged in correctly because sometimes my microphone rather is plugged in correctly. Because sometimes the YouTube app doesn't pick up correctly on my audio input. Anyway, should be okay. So just in terms of the Democratic Convention, I've already done two interviews on it today. One on San Diego morning TV, another on New York City AM radio, and then a third one apparently later on this afternoon, also on the radio somewhere. And just wanted to give a couple thoughts. First, obviously, I titled this video because, as should have been apparent from the outset, Tulsi was not invited to participate in the convention in any respect. And just to be clear, if they had wanted her to participate, even given the truncated format, even given the highly produced Zoom meeting nature of this year's convention, they could have figured out a way to get her in. Andrew Yang complained about being excluded on Twitter, and they rushed apparently to bring him into the fold, so he delivered a fairly pat speech of some sort last night, and he was also in these group chat type events that they had with a number of the other Democratic primary candidates this cycle. And they even had relative non-entities like Seth Moulton. Does anybody even remember that Seth Moulton ran for president? He didn't even make it into any debate. He did not qualify for a single debate. He's a member of Congress from Massachusetts. And he did technically run for president, but few were even aware. And yet he was brought into the fold by the DNC/Biden campaign. And yet Tulsi, who won two delegates, which is two more than Kamala Harris ever won. Remember, Kamala Harris had, in humiliating fashion, had to drop out of the race before voting even started. That's two delegates more than Cory Booker won, then Beto O'Rourke won, then Kirsten Gillibrand won, then Andrew Yang won. The list goes on, and yet they were all invited to participate. Even Tom Steyer, who blew hundreds of billions of dollars in his self-funded campaign for the sole purpose, strategically, of undercutting Biden in South Carolina. That was the premise of Steyer's campaign strategy. He was even invited to participate in abbreviated fashion, but he was there. But not Tulsi, and it was to be expected. She wouldn't have been given, I don't think, free rein to talk about her major issues regardless, which tend to focus on foreign policy, obviously. And to the extent that foreign policy was even brought up during this convention, it was taking a considerably different line than the one that she normally does. So you had Colin Powell, John Kasich, and others touching on foreign policy themes that are just divergent from her emphasis. They only brought up Afghanistan over the course of this entire convention, as far as I could tell, to fulminate about this manufactured story involving Russian bounties allegedly being placed upon U.S. troops in Afghanistan, which was the product of a coordinated series of intelligence community leaks that successfully manipulated, it seemed, Congress into blocking Trump from being able to fully carry out a withdrawal from Afghanistan. And so, given that when Tulsi first ran for Congress in 2012, in part by emphasizing the need to bring greater attention to the fact that we are in the longest war of all time, at least in terms of U.S. history, and it needs to be ended once and for all, despite being perpetuated by both parties through a never-ending campaign of deceit, as the Afghanistan papers from last December made perfectly and plainly clear. All that got quickly forgotten in all the uproar around impeachment at the time, which is also almost entirely forgotten. They didn't even mention that Trump has been impeached at this convention, if I'm recalling correctly. And, if it was so staggeringly important to make sure that Trump was impeached due to his alleged malfeasance vis-a-vis Ukraine, then you think that would bear at least mentioning at this convention, but it was ignored. That's a side point. The main thing is that Tulsi just didn't really fit into the agenda, and obviously on top of that, were she to have spoken, you can bet that they would have played on repeat her exchange with Kamala Harris at the debates last year. And that's not something that Kamala Harris necessarily wants emphasized in a debate that is tailored to make her look as good as possible. So she was excluded. And of course, you have Republicans and conservatives and right-wingers and Trump supporters noticing this and saying to her, oh, you should join Trump. You should join the Republicans. The Democrats are crazy. You need to abandon them and come home to your true support base, which is somehow in their minds the Republicans. Well, that's just another symptom of the chronic disease which flares up regularly of people across the political spectrum, right and left, just simply not listening to her actual words in terms of what her worldview is, what her policy preferences are, and what her political affinities are. She ran for president in part because, she wanted to promote the issues that she feels most strongly about, but she also, I think, genuinely believed that given the opportunity, she would be a strong adversary for Trump, so she could defeat him and remove him from office electorally. That was the premise, one of the premises upon which she decided to run. So this idea that she's just going to join up with Trump, it's just more. It's might be even more detached from reality than the Democrats who scream that she must not be included whatsoever in anything having to do with an official Democratic Party event because of her history, supposedly being under the spell of Putin or Assad or whatever boogeyman they try to erect as the puppeteer controlling her. That's very delusional. Don't get me wrong. But on the flip side, you have Republicans who think that she's a stealth right-winger. That's sort of what Democrats stealthily insinuated about her. Not even stealthily. They overtly, sometimes even just proclaimed it. That she's a right-winger, or that she's she's trying to have some kind of surreptitious third party gambit to undermine the Democrats because she hates them. It's just not true. I mean, it's just not who she is. So I don't understand why there's such an aversion. I mean, I guess I do understand the reasons for it on some level. But even now, even whenever she's in the news or being discussed, I think she's still trending on Twitter as we speak. Yep, Tulsi is the number 4 trending topic Number 3 trending topic on Twitter right now. Maybe that's just because my feed is tailored to shovel me Tulsi news, but nonetheless, she definitely was trending at one point, at least last night. But whenever she comes up, there are always characterizations and extrapolations of her motives made across the spectrum that just had nothing to do with what she actually says and does. The reason she wouldn't join Trump and the Republican Party is because she explicitly and overtly rejects the policy agenda of Trump on both the foreign and domestic domains. And no, she's not in some kind of fundamental agreement with Trump on foreign policy just because Trump is sometimes associated with an aversion to interventionism. Did you miss the entire 2020 primary campaign where she lambasted Trump over and over for his actions in Syria, where he's, essentially extracting or pillaging oil and using U.S. troops to guard Syrian oil fields, and in a sense, keeping up a regime change posture there, even if it's not resulting in overt regime change war at this time? Did you miss her staunch opposition to the Soleimani assassination? Did you miss her constant repudiations of John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, and others who have top-level foreign policy roles or have had them in the Trump administration? Were you clueless when she was fulminating against the new Cold War, which is basically her central, if not the one of her central, if not the central theme of her entire campaign? And guess what? The policy actions undertaken by the Trump administration have exacerbated those dynamics with Russia, but also with China now, which she's also focused on to some extent. And so she's just not in any way simpatico, to use Joe Biden's favorite term recently, or one of them, with Trump really in any policy respect. So this fantasy that she's going to join up with the Republicans is just divorced from what she actually advocates. And most of the time she speaks in pretty plain English. Like, it's not a mystery. And yet motives are always kind of projected onto her that just don't exist. So that's the story with her. The entities that she is being treated to by Republican operatives and infotainment personalities and such, that she should, join leave the dark side and join the Republican enlightened light side, are just, it's just not grounded in reality in any respect. But at the same time, it is sort of interesting that she has cultivated an independent streak, and that's sort of why her allegiances sometimes get called into question. She just has a independence of mind, and that is a reason why people still find her compelling. And it's gonna, I think, guide her as she finishes out her final term here in Congress, and then embarks upon a different project or series of projects once she leaves. And I don't think she knows yet what those precisely are going to be. For example, now she's got more than enough on her plate simply being in Congress, dealing with COVID in Hawaii, which has spiked significantly. She had a press conference around a week ago condemning the Democratic governor and the state health authorities for essentially lying, according to her, about the number of contact tracers that were in place. And this is a Democratic administration in Hawaii, which has done a pretty straightforwardly poor job in containing the virus, which they ought to have been able to do with a unique amount of ability, given that Hawaii is obviously an island state, so they can more easily control who comes in and out, or at least monitor those who come in and out for infection and so forth. But they done a poor job, evidently, and so she took them on by holding a press conference with a whistleblower from the state health agency, who recounted the numerous failings there. And that's just one thing of many, obviously, that she's focused on. And she just left, I believe, within the past 24 hours or so, maybe less, to go to her annual 2-week National Guard mission. So, you know, the mystery that surrounds her is silly. I've never had a hard time interpreting her, because most of the time all you have to do is just listen to what she says, and then she follows through on that, including endorsing the eventual Democratic nominee, which he did with Biden, which, you know, shocked so many people, apparently, even though it was just exactly what she said she was going to do. You know, the video that I did on that when she first endorsed Biden in March, when she dropped out, when the primary was effectively over. You know, it was ratioed on my channel, and everybody was saying they were so betrayed. Well, if you're betrayed, you just weren't paying attention, because you can't claim betrayal if somebody says that if somebody does what they always said they were going to do. You can object, you can criticize, but betrayal, no. Betrayal has to involve some amount of duplicity or misdirection, you'd think. But, you know, with her, there's just this aura of, again, mystery that people try to imbue her with, oddly, which is why now you have speculation about her joining the Republicans, even though she's a lifelong Democrat. She wants Trump out. She endorsed the Democratic nominee, Biden. She has any number of policy criticisms of Trump, especially in foreign policy, which is her primary focus. So it just doesn't make any sense, except it enables Republicans to use her as like a foil against Kamala in particular. So they're just using her as a prop, really. And even when they applaud her exchange with Kamala at those debates, they're not really that interested in the policy substance. They just like that somebody went after Kamala, which I get. I mean, it's emotionally gratifying, because at that point, she really hadn't been challenged on much of anything. So I can see how that would be satisfying. But, you know, I don't believe that the policy substance really interested these right-wingers who declare themselves to have some kind of affinity with Tulsi. I mean, to the extent that they do have an affinity, what I've gleaned is that they like her temperament. They like her rhetorical style. They like her moderate sensibility, not necessarily a moderate policy platform. Although maybe in certain respects, possibly, but it's something almost intangible about her in terms of her cultural attitudes and so forth. Yeah, that's why I kind of thought that she would be. If some world existed where she could be the Democratic nominee, she would do very well. But that's not the case now. Moving on from Tulsi, I rewatched the Biden speech this morning, and look, I thought it was pretty well delivered. And if you think about it from the standpoint of an older voter who maybe has some attachment to legacy Democrats, like the old-fashioned ethnic Irish Democrats in big cities in the Northeast, you know, the Kennedy Democrats, to use sort of a cliche, but you know, it's sort of a real thing. Those are the people who I think the speech was most tailored to. And there was, in that sense, it was probably effective. Because if Biden can just, again, I mentioned this last night, maintain the margins he's currently amassed among voters age 65 and over against Trump, then it's game over. Now there may be some complications there due to the voting procedures being different this year in terms of mail-ins and what have you. That's sort of remains to be seen. But I think you're sort of delusional if you deny the efficacy of this speech from Biden. Doesn't mean you have to agree on the substance. There wasn't a whole lot of substance to agree or disagree with. It was largely characterological. It was largely, full of platitudes. But that's really what any speech is. These are just spectacles for public consumption. So you don't really expect much in the way of policy detail. You're just sort of projecting a sentiment. That's the purpose and function of conventions for the most part. And so went about as well as I think you could have hoped for Biden if you were hoping for him to succeed. And maybe Trump will have a good rebuttal, but I don't know. Calling him a Trojan horse for the radical left, I don't know how well that hits or registers, because he just doesn't have that feeling about him. Now, in a Biden administration, could you imagine people with maybe a little bit more of a radical edge making their way into some agency or gaining a little bit of a bigger foothold? Possibly, but I also think that Biden would diminish or depress some of the radicalism on the left, because they couldn't run around screaming anymore that they have this fascist menace in power who justifies whatever tactic that they want to employ. So I think Biden would have a little bit of a de-radicalizing effect on the left. Whereas with another term of Trump, I mean, it's going to be mayhem still, day after day. Anyway, that's about it, I guess. I mean, I could go on and on, but 23 minutes is enough. Let's see the super chats. Estev asks, I still see people bring up her, meaning Tulsi's, past homophobic views as criticism of her, as well as the Russian asset smear as a reason for why she shouldn't have participated by some commenters. Yeah, I mean, clearly, if she did participate, that was going to be the overwhelming objection, that how could you bring a Russian asset into this convention? You're giving a gift to Putin or something. And so, the people who run the convention and who organized it on behalf of Biden and Harris and whomever, even if in some sense they wanted to make up as broad a tent as possible for the convention, why would they bring upon themselves the controversy that would necessarily create? As ridiculous and wholly unjustified as the controversy is, it would be controversial. Again, she voted present on impeachment. She did sue the former nominee of the party, Hillary Clinton, for defamation. So, I mean, there is some legitimate reason for, I guess, some tension there. That's, in a sense, it would be contrary to the vision of unity that they're trying to project. In terms of the homophobic stuff, I mean, really, you're going to dwell on things that she said when she was 19? And that she's over and over again explained, I think, with sincerity and laid out in pretty comprehensive detail how she evolved in terms of her views on the role of the state in dictating moral affairs and so forth. So, yeah, would there have been controversy? But, I mean, there was everybody who speaks at a convention, not everybody, but so many people who speak at a convention or in one way or another are going to seem or come across as controversial to different constituencies who are watching. Mike Bloomberg spoke. Do I have to even go through the litany of reasons why he is arguably controversial? He's dumped $1.2 billion into the U.S. airwaves in an unprecedented propaganda onslaught, and then ended up like more or less splitting the delegates in American Samoa with Tulsi. That was all he technically won the American Samoa caucus. Other than that, he didn't do as well as he might have hoped. But still, I mean, you have a whole. I mean, we don't have to relitigate Bloomberg. That's just one example. John Kasich, Colin Powell. I mean, controversy. Colin Powell helped sell the country into the Iraq War. Fairly controversial, I would say. And yet he was featured at this convention. I mean, everybody's controversial in one way or another who speaks. So, but Tulsi has a unique set of issues that I guess justified in the minds of the organizers excluding her, even though she did win delegates. And my understanding is historically everybody who gets delegates, unless there's some major issue, tends to be invited to speak. I believe she probably would have been entitled to participate in some sense had there been a physical convention. Number one, because she's a super delegate, and number two, because she had won pledged delegates. So the fact that it was all online and just sort of this organized TV show, variety show thing, enabled them to exclude whoever they wanted to exclude a little more easily. $666 Marquis asks, what happened to Tara Reid? Yeah, what happened? Everybody was so convinced that was a legitimate story. You had progressive media people who staked their credibility on claims that I'm willing to declare, and I said it right away, were just fabricated. I mean, they were fabricated claims. They're discredited and debunked. I'm not getting into all the details now. I did that at the time. You can go read what I wrote at the time, and there were subsequent developments. But if people really, quote, believed her, or they thought that this was such a grave thing, then shouldn't they be, holding up Tara Reid now as this profound victim when, like they did when she first started telling her incredibly far-fetched and uncorroborated story? You'd think. But the fact that they abandoned the story so quickly shows that they were just sort of cynical about it. It was just a ploy on the part of some burning media people as a last-ditch effort to sink Biden. It didn't work. And it was pretty embarrassing. I mean, and there's been almost zero accounting of that journalistic failure. Fraudulent claims of that sort should not be amplified and legitimized by people who purport to be journalists. I mean, that was just a joke. Alrighty. Like I mentioned yesterday, I had that Wall Street Journal column. I believe I had linked to that in the previous live stream, but that's sort of why I'm doing a bunch of interviews today. People, I guess, are interested in talking about the issue of Kamala Harris making common cause with insurrectionary anarchists in Portland who fundamentally reject on an existential level her entire political persona. I mean, Kamala Harris rose through the ranks as a political figure by pledging a harsh law enforcement tack when she was district attorney of San Francisco, and then attorney general of California. She proclaimed herself the top cop. And you have Portland protesters who run around chanting all cops are bastards emphasis on all, because however individually well-intentioned however well-intentioned any individual law enforcement functionary may be, according to the Portland anarchists, it doesn't matter. You're a functionary of a system that they deem inherently white supremacist and fascist, and therefore you need to be abolished. So Kamala Harris would be abolished per the ideological framework set forth by these insurrectionary anarchists, and yet she tries to channel their energies and sentiments by defending them and portraying the Portland protesters merely as moms and veterans. And is there a more benign category or categories of individuals you could ever think of? I mean, who could object to moms and veterans? But it's just a mischaracterization, and you would quickly discover that if you actually went to the protests, at least during the time that I was there in the evening, and found out for yourself what was going on, what they're advocating, who they are, etc. But it speaks to sort of a fundamental tension in the Democratic coalition, where on the one hand you have Kamala Harris sort of required to pay homage to anybody who operates under the claimed banner of Black Lives Matter because of its morally unimpeachable status in the eyes of Democratic politicians and media allies. And then on the other hand, then them not analyzing the underlying ideological prescriptions of the protesters they're defending, who are calling for a variety of fairly radical, not even reforms, revolutionary demands. And it makes for an incoherent, kind of muddled mix when expressed by somebody like Kamala Harris, with given her professional background. So that's the Wall Street Journal piece. Go look that up if you haven't seen it. And one final comment here from my beloved benefactor Sparky, who everybody knows and loves if you follow the stream. He says, the Democratic Convention is like the establishment is trying to lose. I don't know. We shall see. But I'll let that comment from Sparky speak for itself. Okay. Have a nice afternoon, everybody. See you soon. Stay safe. Stay cool. Stay cool, literally. Actually, I don't even know if it's hot out today. Got my AC flowing. I'm one of those guys. Talk to you later.